So, like you said, my name is Nicole Carlson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. There's my email and Twitter handle. And today I'm going to talk to you about things I learned while open sourcing and then maintaining my first library. Just a quick outline, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and the library I open source. The first half will focus on tips I learned while open sourcing my library. The second half will focus on tips for maintaining your library after you've open sourced it, with an emphasis on working with contributors. So a little bit about me. I'm a data scientist at ShopRunner. We're located in Chicago. I'm also a PyLadies and PyData Chicago member, so if you're ever in town, you can usually find me at those meetups. The library I open sourced in January is called PyMC3 Models. If you're not familiar with those tools, PyMC3 is a Python library for describing probabilistic models, so Bayesian inference, and scikit-learn is probably the most widely used machine learning library. The library I built combines those two and allows you to write custom PyMC3 models on top of the scikit-learn API. And you can look at the code on GitHub or download it from PyPI. All right, so the first half is going to focus on things I learned while I was actually open sourcing my library. All right, tip 1, start small. It's really easy to get overwhelmed when you're thinking about releasing a whole project, but it's okay to release a small chunk of work at first. Even that small bit might be useful to someone else. So when I do research for work, I often find half-finished repos on GitHub, and the code is still useful. There hasn't been a single time where I thought, ugh, this is worse than nothing. I wish they hadn't released anything, and I doubt any of you have either. Initially, for PyMC3 models, I had a whole bunch of models I wanted to include, but I ended up only choosing 2 to 3 to start with because I wanted to make sure I got something released. So feel free to start small and incrementally release your project. Similarly, start small and start simple. I recommend starting out with a simple example if possible, so like a hello world for a web framework, or in my case, I did linear regression. So if you're not familiar with linear regression, it's a basic data science model. You have a bunch of points, and you try and draw a straight line through it. And the reason for starting out with a simple example is that this will allow you to focus on the broader structure of your library. So when I was working on linear regression, I didn't really have to think about the math or in theory behind it. I was able to think more about how I wanted to set up the parent and child class structures, how I wanted to set up the folders and unit tests. Then I was able to go back later and add more complicated models once I had this simple stuff set up. This may seem optional, but I highly recommend investing time in creating documentation for your library. So document how it's supposed to be used, how you want people to contribute, and I would definitely put a code of conduct in place. I personally like writing documentation, so it's pretty easy for me to include in the first release. I know a lot of other people may find it tedious and unnecessary, but it will save you a lot of time when you're maintaining your library. And it's a lot better for you to write it before you release your library when you're still calm, rather than when you're in the middle of a heated pull request. If creating all that documentation seems daunting, you can just copy from the best. That's the beauty of open source. So I adapted my guidelines for contributing from PyMC3. I was specifically looking for step-by-step instructions on how to contribute. So git clone, blah, 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 cd, etc. Because I knew there might be people who had the math background to do this stuff, but maybe not the coding background. So you can look for whatever's important to you for your contributor guidelines. My code of conduct is from the Contributor Covenant. If you're not familiar with that, it's a really awesome open source code of conduct specifically designed for open source libraries. I wanted a code of conduct that made it clear what is and isn't acceptable behavior and what to do if you encounter a problem. Depending on your library, you may have other requirements, so just look for something that meets what you need. Borrowing heavily from other open source libraries is totally okay and encouraged. All right, automate what you can. So this is a case of do what I say and not what I do. I regret not having a linter in place when I released PyMC3 models. If you have access to continuous integration, continuous deployment tools, set up your favorite linter and unit tests. I believe a number of the tools have free tiers, like Travis and Circle CI, so you can look for that. If you don't have access to that stuff, you don't have the time, at least put instructions in for what tests should pass before somebody submits a pull request. Obviously, having these in place will save you a lot of time when you're doing reviews, because the tools can do some of the heavy lifting. In addition to saving you time, though, the other big benefit is you can outsource some of your authority to the tools. It's a lot harder for someone to argue with a linter than it is for them to argue with you as a person. All right, so just to recap the open sourcing tips, start small, get something out there, and then increment on top of that. Start simple. You can add all of the complicated stuff later. Invest time in your documentation. It will help you a lot when you're actually maintaining your library. Copy from other people, it's open source, so you can, and automate what you can, specifically linters and unit tests if possible. So now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about tips for once you've actually released your library and you're maintaining it. All right, first one, pace yourself. So once you release your library, you might get a flurry of comments, issues, pull requests. I feel like they come in clumps, and it can feel like you need to address all of these right away, but don't. You can take your time. Don't be like this really frantic turtle. The world's not going to end if you don't reply to an issue right away, and this will help you from getting burnt out. When I started getting issues on PyMC3 models, one thing I did was I would review the smallest ones first, rather than in the order that they actually came. All right, so now is when all of your documentation will come in handy. People will be able to get some of their questions answered through the documentation, so you won't have to spend time answering the same questions over and over again. So let your documentation work for you. Additionally, though, some of the people commenting on your work make it kind of difficult. I'm not necessarily talking about abuse, although that's obviously a huge problem. More things like questioning your choices regarding style and structure, not running unit tests or linting before submitting pull requests, other things like that. Kind of like the behaviors of your most annoying coworker, only you're not getting paid to deal with them, and you don't have a manager to turn to for help. So being able to point them to the documentation can help you a lot. So for example, somebody once opened a GitHub issue on my repo saying that they disagreed with the model I had written that was the basis of the entire library. Fortunately, I had extensive documentation, and I talked about my library before, so I was able to just say, have you watched the linked video, and close the issue immediately. If you continue to have difficult interactions, try to find a supportive community. For me, one such community is the Chicago Tech Diversity Initiative, which is a Slack group of diversity-focused tech groups in Chicago. I was able to go to that group when I was having a really difficult pull request and get validation and advice from them. And it was great because I knew they would understand what I was going through without me having to explain any of the subtext. They would just understand it. So if you can, find a group or individual people to support you. Maybe this is something local to you, maybe this is something online. If you can't find someone, feel free to message me. I'm always happy to talk. But even with your documentation and your supportive community, sometimes the difficult interactions will continue to pile up and overwhelm you. For me, at one point, I dreaded opening up my email in the morning. I was getting sick to my stomach because I was so worried there would be another GitHub notification from some of the difficult people. So I actually ended up walking away from my library for 6 months, and that was okay. So take care of yourself and walk away from your library if you need to. It's okay if you need to leave for a short time or even forever. You can pass things off to another person maybe, somebody who can help you maintain it, but it's also okay if you can't. Your library will continue to be useful even if you can no longer work on it. So just to end on a slightly more positive note, remember to celebrate all the good things. If you've open sourced a library, you should be really proud. Most people don't do that. So this is an issue that somebody opened up on my library. It's just a thank you. I'm obviously never going to close it because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. So try to keep all of the good things in mind when things are going tough. So just to recap, pace yourself. You don't have to deal with everything right away. Let your documentation work for you. Find a supportive community if things are tough. Walk away if you need to. That's okay. And celebrate the good things. So thank you for listening.